Yo, what's happening people, and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to be showing you how you can make dark and moody UK drill beats from scratch. I'll be covering everything from melody creation and drum programming to effects and structuring. If this is your first time on the channel, then consider hitting the subscribe button and click the bell next to it too, so you can be the first to know when I've uploaded new videos. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I'll be planning a giveaway for as soon as I get there. Now with all that stuff out the way, let's get straight into it. So I'm going to start by going over how I made the melody, and in order to get that dark and moody sound, you're going to want to be using some nice atmospheric sounds. So the first thing I added was this pad from Analog Lab, and I went with the 1955 scope preset. I've got my BPM set to 144 and I'm working in a D minor scale, although any minor scale is going to work for these dark beats. Then to quickly go over the pattern, you're going to see that I'm only using 2 notes in my chords, and these are called dyads. Now the pad that I chose has got quite a long tail on it, so that's why I've chose to keep these notes nice and short. And the last thing you want to pay attention to is how I'm using these semitone intervals. And this is going to be the easiest way to achieve a dark sound. So the root of my scale, which is D, is just going to play on each bar, and then I've got these bottom notes alternating between B flat and A. Then to this I've just added an EQ with a low cut at around 110 Hz and then a dip at around 300 Hz. Next I've got an instance of Shaper Box that's just doing some panning, and I've just turned the mix down to around 25%. And then lastly I've got a glue compressor that's just going to squash that sound together a little bit. And once all those effects have been added, my pad now sounds like this. The next sound that I added is also from Analog Lab, and this time I went with the pianos preset. This preset's got a nice vintage feel to it, and that's the reason that I chose it. And I've got this piano patch playing some chords. To get these chords, I just took the dyad from my first pattern and then added some top notes onto it. Then you'll see that I'm using these passing notes to add a bit of rhythm to the progression. One thing to bear in mind when you're making dark melodies is you want to be keeping your passing notes as well as your counter melodies quite close together. So if you take a listen to this first chord, you're going to hear that it sounds quite dark. Whereas if I was to take this D and transpose it up an octave, it's going to sound a lot more happy. Then all I did to find the placement of these passing notes was played the chord progression through and just imagine where I could hear them coming in. And without effects, this is how the chord progression sounds. Then for effects on this, I've gone with Guitar Rig, and I'm using my favourite Vocal Space preset. And I know some of you might be wondering why I'm using a guitar plugin on a piano, but Guitar Rig is going to sound good on pretty much anything that you put it on. And what I usually do is I come into the Characters tab and then I'll select Clean. Another good way to find presets would be to go into the genres and choose pop or hip hop. You can find some good presets in some of the other genre tabs as well, however a lot of them are very metal inspired. Then I've just got another EQ that's going to be cutting out everything below around 110 Hz. And now the piano sounds like this. Next up I wanted to add a counter melody, and for this I found this guitar patch also inside Analog Lab, and it's called Bench. This preset matches up nicely with the vintage sound and piano because I feel like this guitar's got a nice vintage sound to it too. And to get this melody I took the same notes that I used in my chords and just found a nice picking pattern that I liked. And this is the pattern that I came up with. Again, I've used the Vocal Space preset inside of Guitar Rig. I then added an instance of Soothe 2 using the Acoustic Guitar Warmer preset, and this is just going to tame some of the resonant frequencies. Next I added an EQ, and I'm just cutting out the highs and the low frequencies to really bring out the mids. Then to add a bit of space to the guitar, I've added Valhalla Vintage Verb, and I've got the mix turned right down to 8%. Then the next thing I added was the June 6 chorus from Arturia, and I'm using the Subtle 1 preset with my mix at around 75%. And now all those effects have been added, the guitar now sounds like this. And I don't think any ambient or moody drill beat is going to be complete without adding some vocals in there somewhere. So I've gone to the vocalize bank inside of Contact for this. I'm using the A minor preset here, but I've just tuned it up by 5 semitones just to make sure that it all stays in key. This bank's going to play a vocal phrase for each note that you put down, and this is the pattern that I came up with. Then to this I added an EQ that's cutting everything below around 190 Hz, and then I've got a dip at around 700 Hz. And again, I'm using Soothe 2 to tame some of them resonant frequencies. Next up, I've gone with Valhalla Vintage Verb, and I've got my mix at around 13%. Shaper box with the pan shaper, and this is just going to add a bit of width to my vocals. Then I noticed that this second phrase has got a lot of high frequencies in it, which made it seem a bit louder, so I've got a glue compressor to just squash it all together. Next, I just froze this track and flattened it to turn it into audio, and this is going to allow me to have a low version that's pitched down and a high version too. Once I've bounced them to audio, I then put them in this vocal group, and I'm just using wider to really push them vocals out to the sides of the mix. And once all those effects have been added, the vocals now sound like this. So now that I've got all my melodic elements, I just placed them into a group, and then I added some effects to the group. First up, I added RC20 with the vinyl 3 preset, and as always, I've got the noise turned right down. Next, I added a tape stop plugin, but I'll go into a bit more detail about this when I go over the structuring. I then added Arturia's Tape Mellow-Fi with the fat analog preset, and just like RC20, I always turn the noise module as well as the mechanics down. And lastly, there's an auto filter that's doing some automation, but again, I'll touch on that when I go over the structuring. And my final melody sounds like this. Now moving on to the drums, the first thing that I like to add is the hi-hat, and that's because I feel like it gives me a nice rhythm to start the rest of the drums on. And starting out, I just placed down a regular 2-step drill pattern, but I felt like the hi-hats needed a bit of space towards the end of each bar, so I just took some of the notes out. And the last thing I did then was at the end of each 4 bars, I just added these little rolls. And on these hi-hats, I've got Fresh Air by Slate Digital. I then added Ableton's stock chorus plugin, and I'm using the vibrato setting at 85%. Next, I added Ableton's hybrid reverb with the mix at 23%. This reverb plugin is really good because it allows you to drag a sample in, and the reverb's characteristics are going to be based on which sample you're dragging. Then lastly, I've got an auto filter. Again, that's just doing some automation, and I'll go over that when I talk about the structuring. And this is how the hi-hats sound with all of those effects on. Now because I left some space in the hi-hats, I chose to fill that space using my snare. Then all I did here was press record and then just use my keyboard to put my snare pattern down. And all I added to this was a hybrid reverb, but this time I've got my mix set to 13%. Next up, I added some percussion, and I've just got this impact hitting on the drop, and then I've also got this wooden block sound. Then to add some bounce to the drum loop, I've added this open hi-hat. Next up is my 808 pattern, and this is pretty much just following the root notes of the chord progressions, and then I'm adding slides in between. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how I do my slides in Ableton Live because that's a whole nother separate video, so if you want to see that, then leave me a comment below. But yeah, like I said, this is pretty much just following the root notes of my chord progression, and then I'm using these slides to just keep things interesting. On my 808, I've got RC20 and I'm just using a distort module to add some distortion to it. And then I'm using this focus here to make sure that it's not distorting any of the lows and too much of the highs. Next up, I've got an EQ, and this is just taking out some of the higher frequencies. And then I'm using this side chaining method here to leave some room for the kick. Next up, I'm using Knock by Decap, and I'm using this just to add a bit of extra saturation. This is then going into Saturn 2, which is another multi-band saturation plugin, and I'm using a Magic BM preset. And then lastly, I'm using a glue compressor sidechain to my kick, and again, this is just going to make a bit of extra room for the kick. So the last drum track I need to go over is the kick, and to get this pattern I literally took my 808 pattern and copied it straight in. All I did then was made sure that all of my notes were hitting on the same key, and then I've added some of these kick rolls towards the end. Then all I've got on my kick is another instance of Saturn 2 using a Magic BM preset. I'm then using an EQ with a low shelf, and this is just going to boost the area that I cut out of the 808. So the only thing left to do now is to go over the structuring of the beat, and to be honest, this one's quite simple. So to start out, I've got an 8-bar intro that's playing my pad, my piano, and a lower version of the vocals. And this then drops into a 16-bar hook where the high vocals come in as well as my guitar. Then what I like to do for my hooks is halfway through, I like to just take the kick and the snare out, and then I'll reintroduce them about 2 bars later. Next up is the verse, and you're going to see here that I like to drop a lot of the elements out for the start of the verse. I'll always take out the kick and I'll make a simplified version of the 808, and then later on in the verse I'll bring all of these elements back in. Next up, I added a pre-hook, and again I've dropped most of the elements out for this, and I've just left the hi-hat in for the drums. I'm using a really simplified and low energy version of my 808 because the high energy version is going to come back in when the hook drops. I'm then using automation on my auto filter just to sweep the hi-hats into the hook. And the last thing I should mention is I'm using this riser and this crash to really add some emphasis to the drop. And then yeah, from here it will just drop back into the hook, and then everything repeats. And yeah, this is how the full beat sounds. So yeah, that is going to bring us to the end of today's video. Leave me a comment below and let me know how you think the beat turned out. If you enjoyed the video or if you learned anything new from it, then make sure to leave a like before you leave. And if you're new to the channel, then smash that subscribe button. Massive shout out to anybody that's still here at the end of the video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.